I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The wedding of Celia Randall and Major Richard Blake was supposed to be the crowning social achievement of the season in St. Mary Mead. The air inside the ancient stone walls of the parish church was heavy with the scent of lilies and the hushed, expectant murmurs of the village's most prominent residents. Even the sunlight, filtering through the medieval stained glass, seemed to favour the occasion, casting vibrant patterns of ruby and sapphire across the aisle. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, her knitting needles tucked away for the sanctity of the service, her hands folded neatly over her prayer book. Her eyes, however, remained characteristically active, observing the subtle rigidness in the Major's shoulders and the way the bride's hand trembled as she adjusted her lace veil. To the casual onlooker, it was a picture of matrimonial bliss. To Miss Marple, it was a study in repressed tension. The centerpiece of the bride's ensemble was the legendary Star of the Orient, a breathtaking sapphire pendant that had been a Blake family heirloom for generations. It hung from Celia's neck, a deep, hypnotic blue that seemed to capture the very essence of the afternoon sky. As the ceremony concluded and the procession moved toward the church porch for photographs, the mood was one of high celebration. The village children threw handfuls of rose petals, and the bells of St. Mary's rang out with a joyous, metallic clangor. It was during this transition from the solemnity of the altar to the festivity of the churchyard that the first note of discord was struck. The reception was held under a white marquee on the Blake estate's lawns. Laughter and the clinking of champagne flutes filled the air, yet a strange shadow seemed to pass over the bride. Miss Marple, sipping a modest glass of lemon squash near the buffet, noticed Celia suddenly pale and reach for her throat. The heavy gold chain remained, but the Star of the Orient, the priceless blue jewel, was gone. A sharp, piercing cry from Celia's bridesmaid signaled the discovery to the rest of the guests, and the music of the local string quartet ground to an awkward, dissonant halt. The joy of the afternoon evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, prickling sensation of collective suspicion. The disappearance of the jewel was followed by an even more horrifying realization. When the Major went to find his new bride a chair to recover from the shock, he discovered her slumped against the stone sundial at the edge of the rose garden. Her eyes were wide, fixed on a point far beyond the festivities, and her pulse was absent. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no jagged wounds or bruised skin, yet life had been extinguished as surely as a candle in a gale. In the center of a crowded garden, amidst her friends and family, the bride had been robbed and murdered with a terrifying, silent efficiency. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the crowd, her gaze moving from the empty gold chain on the grass to the ashen face of the Major. The wedding feast had turned into a funeral wake, and the secret of the missing sapphire had just become a matter of life and death. The morning after tragedy at Blake Estate, St. Mary Mead, felt as though it was suffering from a collective throbbing headache. The transition from the exuberant peal of wedding bells to the grim finality of a police cordon was too abrupt for the village to process, without the aid of significant amounts of tea and unbridled speculation. At the local post office, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool and the electric thrill of a shared disaster. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose capacity for indignation was matched only by her hearing, was already presiding over a small court of parishioners near the counter. She proclaimed to anyone within earshot that the crime was undoubtedly the work of an international gang of jewel thieves who had likely parachuted into the meadow behind the church under the cover of the bridal procession. It was far more comforting for the village to imagine a predatory, sophisticated outsider than to accept that one of their own had committed murder during a hymn. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was in her own garden, meticulously pruning her hybrid tea roses. Her old friend, Mrs. Hartnell, who had arrived breathless with the latest developments from the inner circles of village intelligence, joined her. Mrs. Hartnell's theories were less global than Mrs. Price Ridley's, but far more pointed. She was convinced the crime was a direct result of the Major's decision to marry a girl from outside the county. She was a lovely girl, Jane, but no one knew her people, Mrs. Hartnell insisted, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And the Major's sister, Muriel, was seen looking at that sapphire with a most peculiar expression during the ceremony. To lose a family heirloom to a stranger is a bitter pill for a woman of Muriel's temperament. I wouldn't be surprised if she decided that if the family couldn't have the jewel, no one would. Miss Marple listened with the patient, slightly distracted air of a cat watching a bird through a window. She knew that gossip was like a kaleidoscope. Every time you shook it, the pieces rearranged themselves into a different, yet equally colourful, pattern of human frailty. "People do love a dramatic motive, don't they, dear?" she replied mildly, her scissors making a soft, rhythmic snip. "But it reminds me so much of the time the old draper's wife thought a secret rival was poisoning her husband, when in fact he had simply been eating too many of those very rich tinned sardines. We often look for the grand passion when the truth is something much more mundane and, I'm afraid, much more selfish. One must always ask, not just who hated the bride, but who needed the sapphire." Across the village at the Blue Boar, the conversation was more robust and considerably more cynical. Local men discussed Major's notoriously thin finances. It was whispered that the Star of the Orient was the only thing standing between the Blake estate and the auctioneer's gavel. To the men at the bar, the Major had finally found a way to collect the insurance without having to share the asset with a wife who might have had her own ideas about spending. There was also much talk of the mysterious cousin from London, a Mr. Raymond West, who had been seen lurking near the vestry door and who possessed the kind of sleek, urban appearance that the village instinctively distrusted. The reaction of the household at the Blake estate was one of stunned, hollowed-out silence. The Major had retreated into a state of military detachment, while the servants moved through the rooms like ghosts, their usual vibrant energy extinguished by the presence of the police and the heavy, lingering smell of fingerprint powder. They were acutely aware that the village was watching them, judging the sincerity of their grief and the timing of their movements. In a small town, a murder is not just a crime, it is a social performance, and the audience is relentlessly critical of the actors. Miss Marple, observing the flow of people past her garden gate, noted the subtle changes in the village's equilibrium. She saw the way the bridesmaids, still in their pale silk dresses, walked with a rigid, frozen posture, their eyes fixed straight ahead. She noted how the curate, Mr. Billingham, seemed to have developed a sudden, persistent cough that kept him confined to the vicarage. These were the small, jagged edges of the truth beginning to poke through the fabric of village life. To the rest of the world, these were just the reactions of stressed individuals. But Miss Marple knew better. She knew that beneath the shared horror and the endless chatter at the post office, there were specific, private reliefs and specific, private terrors. The village had reacted with a roar of gossip, but the real secrets were being kept in the silences between the words. The arrival of Inspector Slack at the Blake estate was as subtle as a gale-force wind tearing through a delicate flower bed. He was a man of immense, almost wearying energy, possessing a mind that functioned like a well-oiled machine, though Miss Marple often felt it was a machine that had been programmed to look only at the obvious cogs. To Slack, Celia Randall's murder was a matter of physics and opportunity. He spent the morning measuring the distance from the marquee to the sundial, timing the gait of a man in a hurry, and demanding a list of every guest who had left their seat during the speeches. He was the sort of man who believed that the truth was a thing that could be pinned to a board like a dead butterfly, provided one used enough pins. Miss Marple, meanwhile, remained on the periphery of the official activity, appearing to be deeply concerned with the progress of her knitting. Yet her eyes were far busier than her fingers. She sat on a folding chair near the rose garden, her vantage point allowing her to observe the suspects as they were summoned one by one for questioning. She noticed the way Major Richard Blake kept smoothing his moustache, a gesture that in her experience suggested not grief, but a profound, gnawing anxiety about appearances. She also watched the Major's sister, Muriel, who stood near the refreshment table with a glass of sherry that remained entirely untouched. Muriel's eyes were not on the police, but on the ground near the sundial, as if she were searching for something far smaller than a sapphire. The early investigation focused heavily on physical theft. Slack was convinced that a professional had slipped into the crowd, snipped the chain, and made a clean getaway through the woods. He spent hours examining the clasp of the gold chain, looking for tool marks or signs of force. To him, the murder was an unfortunate secondary necessity of a robbery. He began to theorize that the bride had caught the thief in the act, leading to a fatal struggle. However, when the medical examiner, Dr. Haydock, mentioned that there were no signs of a struggle and that the cause of death appeared to be a sudden, massive cardiac failure, possibly induced by a chemical agent. Slack merely grunted and adjusted his theory to include a poisoned needle. "It is quite remarkable," Miss Marple remarked to the vicar's wife later that afternoon, "how the police always look for the most difficult way to do a thing. They treat it like a chapter from a sensational novel. But in my experience, a crime committed in a crowd is usually the simplest act imaginable. It reminds me so much of the time the old schoolmaster lost his spectacles at the village fete. Everyone looked in the bushes and the pond, but the spectacles were simply hanging from the back of his own collar, where his grandson had hooked them as a joke. One's expectations can be a very powerful blindfold." Miss Marple was particularly interested in a detail that the inspector had dismissed as trivial: the rose petals, while the police were looking for footprints. She had noticed that the petals scattered near the sundial were not the same color as the ones thrown at the church. These were a deep, bruised crimson, and they appeared to have been crushed by something much heavier than a bridal slipper. Furthermore, she had observed that the Major's cousin from London, Mr. Raymond West, had changed his boutonniere 3 times during the afternoon, a display of vanity that struck her as being particularly out of character for a man of his supposed intellect. She began to ponder the nature of sapphire itself. The Star of the Orient was not just a jewel, it was a symbol of a family's history and its perceived status. If the Major's finances were as precarious as the village gossip suggested, the jewel was a burden as much as a blessing. She watched as Muriel Blake finally moved toward the sundial, her movements stiff and unnatural. Muriel did not look at the spot where her sister-in-law had fallen instead. She reached down and adjusted a single loose stone in the sundial's base. It was a small, almost invisible gesture, but to Miss Marple it spoke of a secret that was being kept in plain sight. While the inspector looked for the who through the how, Miss Marple was beginning to find the who through the why. She sat in the fading afternoon light, her mind weaving a much more complex tapestry than the one Inspector Slack was so busily constructing. The following morning, the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had solidified into a state of grim, self-righteous certainty. Inspector Slack, a man who viewed any delay in an arrest as a personal affront to the Crown, had finally identified his quarry. The obvious suspect had emerged in the form of Mr. Raymond West, the Major's cousin from London. To the inspector, Raymond was the perfect embodiment of the shifty urbanite, a man with expensive tastes, a languid manner, and a suspicious lack of a visible income. The evidence, as presented by Slack to a small, breathless group of village elders, was a masterpiece of circumstantial tidiness. It was discovered that Raymond had been seen by the gardener's boy hovering near the sundial moments before the alarm was raised, and more damningly, a small, silver-handled pair of jeweler's snips had been found tucked into the lining of his valise. Furthermore, a search of the grounds had revealed a discarded silk handkerchief, monogrammed with an R, snagged on a briar near the estate's boundary wall. For Slack, it was equivalent to a signed confession. He theorized that Raymond, acting under the pressure of mounting gambling debts in the city, had planned the theft with the cold-blooded precision of a professional. He suggested that the young man had approached the bride under the guise of offering congratulations, used a fast-acting inhalant to incapacitate her, and then vanished into the woods to stash the jewel before returning to the marquee to play the part of the concerned relative. By noon, Raymond West was being escorted to a police car, his face a mask of weary, supercilious disdain that the village interpreted as the arrogance of a court criminal. Miss Marple, however, remained profoundly unconvinced. She sat in her parlour with a glass of her own homemade cowslip wine, her expression one of mild, troubled contemplation. She had watched the arrest from her window. While the village had seen a villain apprehended, she had seen a man whose primary fault was an overdeveloped sense of his own importance. Raymond West was many things pretentious, perhaps, and certainly fond of his own voice, but he was not a man of action. He was the sort of person who wrote about crimes in his modern, difficult novels, but who would likely faint at the sight of a real poisoned needle. The idea of him executing a silent murder in a crowded garden seemed to her to be a fundamental mismatch of character. "It is all so very convenient, isn't it?" she remarked to Mrs. Bantry, who had dropped by in a state of high agitation to discuss the monster in their midst. The snips in the bag, the monogrammed handkerchief left like a trail of breadcrumbs, the public motive of gambling debts. It reminds me so much of the time the old verger was accused of stealing the communion plate, because it was found under his bed. Everyone forgot that the verger had been bedridden for a week, and that the door to his room had no latch. When a piece of evidence is left exactly where it is most likely to be found, I always find myself wondering who wanted it to be found there. Mrs. Bantry blinked, her tea cooling in her hand. But Jane, the snips, he couldn't explain why he had them. He just kept saying he used them for his hobby of collecting antique watch gears. And the Major says Raymond has been asking for a loan for months. People do desperate things when they are cornered by the bank. Desperate things, yes, Miss Marple agreed, her knitting needles picking up a brisk, determined pace. But usually they are messy things. A man like Raymond, if he were to steal, would likely have tried a clumsy forgery or a subtle embezzlement. To commit a murder in the middle of a wedding reception requires a level of physical nerve and a disregard for the social order that Raymond simply does not possess. He cares too much about what people think of him to be caught with a dead body at a garden party. No, this has the feel of a stage set, Dolly, and the police are merely the audience that the real killer has invited to watch the performance. Miss Marple's mind turned instead to the crushed crimson petals and the curious behaviour of Muriel Blake near the sundial. She remembered the way the Major's sister had looked at the bride knot with hatred, but with a kind of possessive, ancient pride, as if Celia were merely a mannequin for the family jewels. She also thought of the Major himself, whose grief seemed to consist entirely of a series of rehearsed military platitudes. If Raymond West were indeed a scapegoat, then the person who had framed him must be someone who knew his habits, his luggage, and his financial troubles intimately. As the shadows of the late afternoon stretched across her garden, Miss Marple realized that the arrest of Raymond West was not the end of the case, but the successful completion of the killer's first act. The real danger was that the inspector was so satisfied with the obvious that he had stopped looking for the truth. The following morning, Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the scene of the tragedy, appearing to the casual observer as nothing more than a frail old lady searching for a lost knitting needle among the manicured flower beds of the Blake estate. The police had moved their primary operations back to the station, leaving the gardens in the care of a single, disinterested constable who was more concerned with his pipe than the movements of an elderly villager. The white marquee still stood, its canvas walls flapping mournfully in the light breeze, but Miss Marple's focus was entirely on the area surrounding the stone sundial. She moved with a slow, deliberate step, her eyes scanning the ground with the patient intensity of a bird looking for a specific twig. She was not looking for the sapphire, nor was she looking for the jeweller's snips that had supposedly sealed Raymond West's fate. Instead, she was examining the very base of the sundial where she had seen Muriel Blake lingering the previous day. She noticed that the loose stone Muriel had adjusted was not merely a decorative quirk, it was a piece of ancient masonry that had been weathered into a slightly different shape than its neighbours. With the aid of her umbrella handle, Miss Marple gently pried the stone forward. Behind it lay a small, hollowed-out cavity in the mortar, empty now, but bearing the unmistakable mark of recent use. A faint, silvery dust clung to the edges of the hole, not the dust of the garden, but the fine, metallic shavings one might find in a workshop. It was as she stood up, brushing the dirt from her skirt, that she noticed the hidden clue that had escaped the inspector's energetic measurements. Caught in a particularly thorny branch of the crimson rosebush, the same bush that had provided the crushed petals she had noticed earlier, was a tiny, translucent fragment of what appeared to be celluloid. It was curved, no larger than a fingernail, and bore a faint, blue-tinted residue on its underside. To a man like Slack, this was merely garden debris, but to Miss Marple, who understood the domestic mechanics of a large household, it was a profound anomaly. It was a fragment of a very specific type of protective cap used by photographers to shield the delicate lenses of their equipment. She picked it up with her handkerchief, her mind working through the social implications of its presence. There had been a village photographer present at the wedding, a quiet man named Mr. Applegate, who had been darting in and out of the crowd all afternoon. However, Applegate used a modern, black-bodied camera that required no such antique caps. This fragment belonged to an older, much more specialized piece of equipment, the kind used by a connoisseur of high-speed optical illusions. It reminded her of the time the local postmaster had tried to convince the village he had seen a ghost in the belfry, when in fact he had merely been playing with a magic lantern and a piece of curved glass to hide his own late-night activities. Miss Marple then turned her attention to the sundial itself. She noticed that the shadow cast by the gnomon did not match the time on her own reliable watch. It was off by nearly 15 minutes. In a garden where everything was maintained with military precision, such a discrepancy was a glaring error. She realized then that the sundial had been moved, or rather, it had been used as a lever. The metallic shavings in the cavity and the blue residue on the celluloid fragment suggested a crime that was not a sudden act of passion, but a masterpiece of optical and mechanical timing. The Star of the Orient had not been stolen in a frantic moment. It had vanished through a process of careful redirection. She looked back toward the marquee, where the Major was now standing, speaking in hushed, urgent tones with his sister. The hidden clue suggested that the murder was not the primary objective of the afternoon, but a tragic necessity to hide the fact that the sapphire had never actually been around the bride's neck during the reception. The blue-tinted celluloid was a fragment of a Fica, cleverly constructed lens designed to catch the sun and mimic the sparkle of a jewel for the benefit of the cameras and the distant guests. While the inspector was chasing a thief in the woods, Miss Marple realized that the real crime was a massive, desperate fraud. The bride had died because she had discovered, perhaps at the very moment she reached for her throat, that she was wearing nothing but a piece of theatrical glass. The secret was not in the theft, but in the absence of the thing itself. The following afternoon, Miss Marple found herself seated in the small, cluttered office of Mr. Applegate, the village photographer. The room was thick with the developer's chemical tang and the dusty scent of old negatives. Mr. Applegate was a man who lived his life through a lens, a habit that had made him an unintentional repository for the village's visual history. As Miss Marple sipped a cup of tea that tasted faintly of fixative, she began to guide the conversation toward the history of the Blake family. She knew that in a place like St. Mary Mead, a family's decline was often documented in the changing quality of their portraits, from the grand oil-painted ancestors to the increasingly sparse and strained photographs of the modern generation. "The Blakes have always been a proud lot, Miss Marple," Applegate remarked, his hands stained with the dark ink of his trade. "But pride is an expensive luxury. I remember taking the Major's portrait 5 years ago, just after he inherited the estate. He insisted on having the Star of the Orient in the shot, but he was most particular about how it was lit. He didn't want the camera too close. I thought it was just vanity, but looking back at the negatives, there was a peculiar dullness to the stone even then. It lacked the fire one expects from a sapphire of that caliber. It reminded me of a case in a neighboring county where a family replaced their heirlooms with paste to pay off a gambling debt, only to find themselves living in a house of glass. This revelation confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicion that the sapphire's disappearance was not a sudden act of greed, but the final stage of a long-term deception. She then turned her attention to the relationship between the Major and his sister, Muriel. She decided to pay a visit to the local draper, Mr. Ross, who was known to be a man of keen observation regarding the social hierarchy of the village. From her seat in the shop, she watched as Muriel Blake walked past the window, her posture rigid and her face set in a mask of grim determination. "She's a hard one, that Muriel," Mr. Ross observed, measuring out a length of black crepe for a funeral veil. "She's been the one keeping that estate together for years. The Major has the titles and the uniform, but Muriel has the ledger. She was never happy about the marriage, you know. She saw Celia as a threat to the family's stability. Celia was a modern girl, always asking questions about the accounts and wondering why the Major was so reluctant to have the jewels professionally appraised for insurance purposes. There was a terrible row about it just a week before the wedding. Celia wanted to take the sapphire to London to be cleaned, and Muriel nearly had an apoplectic fit at the very suggestion. Miss Marple listened, her mind weaving these threads of resentment and financial desperation into a cohesive pattern. The motive was becoming clear. The marriage had threatened to expose the fact that the Star of the Orient had been sold or pawned years ago. The Major and Muriel were living a lie, maintaining the illusion of wealth to keep their social standing in the county. Celia, with her youthful curiosity and desire for transparency, had unwittingly become a dangerous liability. The wedding was meant to be the final confirmation of the family's status, but instead, it had become the catalyst for its exposure. She thought back to the metallic shavings she had found in the sundial and the blue-tinted celluloid fragment. It suggested that Muriel, the practical manager of the household, had designed a mechanical solution to the problem. The sundial was not just a marker of time, it was a hiding place for the device that had projected the illusion of the jewel. But Celia must have noticed something. Perhaps the fake had shifted in the sun, or perhaps she had felt the weight of the paste substitute and realized it was a sham. At that moment the illusion had shattered, and the Major or Muriel had been forced to act to prevent the scandal from becoming public. The murder was not about the value of the stone, but the value of the secret. Miss Marple realized the village was witnessing a tragedy of pride, where a life had been traded for the preservation of a hollow family name. As she walked back to her cottage, the shadows of the elms seemed to stretch toward her like the fingers of the past, reminding her that the most deadly secrets are often those we keep to protect our own vanity. The following morning, the fragile equilibrium of St. Mary Mead was shattered not by another act of violence, but by a revelation that seemed to turn the entire investigation into a hall of mirrors. Just as Inspector Slack was preparing his final brief against Raymond West, a second confession arrived, not in person, but in the form of a typed letter delivered to the local constabulary. The letter was unsigned, yet it contained details about the Major's financial past that only an intimate associate could have known. It claimed that the Star of the Orient had not been stolen at all, but was currently in the possession of a secret lover whom Celia had been planning to meet after the ceremony. This sudden shift from a crime of local greed to a plot of matrimonial betrayal and blackmail sent the inspector into a state of frantic, redirected energy. Miss Marple, hearing of the letter through the rapid-fire delivery of the milkman, did not join in the general sense of excitement. She recognized the letter for what it was, a masterfully executed piece of misdirection designed to blacken the character of the deceased and provide a more palatable, London-style motive that would naturally appeal to a man of Inspector Slack's prejudices. If Celia were portrayed as a faithless bride fleeing with a family heirloom, the Major's reputation would be preserved even as his jewel vanished. The twist was a clever one, reinforcing the true killer's deception by providing a motive that would lead the police to search for a phantom lover who simply did not exist. It allowed the killer to remain in the shadows as authorities hunted ghosts in London train stations. While the inspector was busy telegramming Scotland Yard, Miss Marple decided to visit the estate's gardener, Mr. Tilling. She found him near the potting shed, his movements as precise and measured as a clockwork toy. He was a man who lived in a world of soil and seasons, yet as Miss Marple watched him, she noticed a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor in his hands as he handled a heavy iron rake. The shed was quiet, the air smelling of peat and dried herbs, but the tension was as thick as a winter fog. She noticed a small, black-lacquered box sitting on his workbench, the kind of box used to store high-quality optical lenses or perhaps a very specific type of stage makeup. "It is quite remarkable, isn't it, Mr. Tilling?" she said, her voice dropping into its most innocent conversational tone. "How a single drop of something can change the entire nature of a garden. I was thinking of poor Mrs. Blake and that blue jewel she was so proud of. It reminded me so much of the time the old schoolmaster thought he had found a rare sapphire in his attic, only to realize that the stone was actually a piece of blue glass from a magic lantern. He had such a touching faith in the power of appearances. But then, appearances can be very deceptive when one knows how to use the light." Tilling's face did not change, but his eyes became suddenly, sharply focused. "Light is a tool like any other, Miss Marple. In the garden, it makes things grow in the house. It reveals the dust. The Major was a man who preferred the light to be exactly where he wanted it. As for that letter the police received, I'm sure it's just the work of someone who spent too much time at the cinema. People always want to believe in a scandal, provided it distracts them from the rot in their own floorboards." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed, her blue eyes never leaving him. But a cinema fan wouldn't know about the metallic shavings in the sundial, would they? Or about the way a certain blue-tinted lens can hide the absence of a stone just long enough for the cameras to click. It reminds me so much of the time the local postmaster tried to hide a deficit in the accounts by claiming a ghost had stolen the stamps. The truth has a way of being very local, no matter how much we try to make it look like a grand romance. As she left the garden, Miss Marple noticed a small black car parked discreetly around the corner. It belonged to Muriel Blake, but the Major's sister was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she saw the Major himself sitting in the library window, his face a mask of exhaustion and something that looked very much like relief. This new revelation, the alliance between the Major's pride and the gardener's technical skill, added a final, complicating layer to the mystery. Had Tilling, a man of surprising mechanical aptitude, assisted in the fraud to protect his own position? Or was he the one who had finally turned the fraud into a murder when the bride became too inquisitive? The twist of the anonymous letter had succeeded in confusing the police, but for Miss Marple, it had served only to highlight the desperation of the perpetrator. The killer was no longer just protecting their freedom, they were fighting to maintain the narrative of the crime. She walked home slowly, her mind settling on the one test that would force the actor to miss their cue. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long, skeletal shadows across the grounds of the Blake estate as Miss Marple made her way toward the library. She did not seek out the inspector, nor did he seek her. He was currently occupied with a frantic search for the Pontiac London lover mentioned in the anonymous letter. Instead, she found herself in the presence of Major Richard Blake. The room was thick with the scent of old leather and stale tobacco, a masculine sanctuary that felt increasingly like a tomb. The Major was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, his posture so rigid it seemed as though his very bones were made of iron. He looked up as she entered, his expression one of weary military patience that did not quite mask the flicker of apprehension in his eyes. "Good afternoon, Major," Miss Marple said, her voice dropping into that tone of gentle, fluttery concern she used so effectively. "I do hope you've managed to find a moment of peace. It is such a trial, the constant pressure of these past few days. I was just saying to the vicar that we must all look after one another when the shadows of the past come to light. It reminded me so much of a young man I once knew in St. Mary, the nephew of our local magistrate, actually. He was a very proud boy, much like yourself, but he found himself in a position where he had to choose between his reputation and his conscience. He had lost something, not through theft, but through a series of very unfortunate investments." The Major's hand moved instinctively to his moustache, a gesture Miss Marple noted with clinical interest. "Reputation is everything to a man in my position, Miss Marple, but I fail to see what this has to do with the tragic death of my wife." Miss Marple took a seat opposite him, her knitting bag resting in her lap, though she did not begin to knit. Instead, she leaned forward, her blue eyes bright with a sharp, unwavering clarity. "The Star of the Orient was a very heavy burden for you, was it not? A jewel that represented a wealth you no longer possessed. I imagine it was quite a struggle to maintain the facade, especially when Celia began to ask for the insurance papers and suggested a professional cleaning in London. It is a terrifying thing when the person you love becomes the very person who might accidentally pull the thread that unravels your entire life. It reminds me of the time the old colonel at the Grange tried to hide a hole in the carpet by placing a heavy vase over it, only for his daughter to try and move the vase to make room for her wedding flowers. She watched the Major's throat move as he swallowed hard. The psychological pressure in the room was almost tangible, like the gathering of a summer storm. "The blue-tinted celluloid I found near the sundial was a very clever piece of work," she continued softly. "It combined the gardener's knowledge of optical lenses with your own need for a distraction. During the ceremony, the jewel was a last, desperate appearance before it was to be stolen later that night for insurance. But during the reception, under that bright sun, you couldn't risk it being seen too closely. You replaced it with a fake, a lens designed to catch the light and fool the cameras. But Celia found out, didn't she? She felt the lightness of the chain, or perhaps saw the lens shift in the breeze. And in that moment, the pride of the Blakes was more important to you than the life of the woman you had just married." The Major stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back with a heavy thud. "This is preposterous. You are suggesting I killed my own bride for a piece of glass. There is no proof, nothing but the ramblings of an old woman who spends too much time with her needles. The proof is not in the needles, Major, Miss Marple said, her voice becoming suddenly, sharply focused. It is in the sundial. You see, the metallic shavings I found there match the tools in Mr. Tilling's shed, but the fingerprints on the inner cavity, the ones the inspector will find once I tell him where to look, belong to the man who placed the real sapphire there for safekeeping before the theft could be staged. You didn't mean to kill her, perhaps. You only meant to silence her, to use a little too much of that sedative in her champagne to keep her quiet until the guests had gone. But her heart was not as strong as your ambition. You are caught in a trap of your own making, Major, squeezed between the memory of a murder and the weight of a stolen secret. She saw it then, the sudden, sharp flicker of absolute terror in his pupils. It wasn't the reaction of a man who had been insulted, but the reaction of a man who had been seen. He looked at Miss Marple not as a frail villager, but as a mirror reflecting his own darkest self. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to die in his throat. Miss Marple remained in the chair, her expression one of quiet, determined sadness. The game was in its final stages. She had pushed the witness out into the open, and she knew the Major would have no choice now but to watch as the house of glass he had built came crashing down around him. The following morning, the morning room of the Blake estate was filled with a tension so thick it seemed to dampen the very sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Inspector Slack was present, appearing remarkably ruffled after a night of fruitlessly chasing the phantom London lover through telegraph records, while Muriel Blake stood by the fireplace, her face a mask of pale, aristocratic indifference. Major Richard Blake sat behind his desk, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles were bone-white. Miss Marple sat in a straight-back chair, her knitting needles clicking with a soft, inexorable rhythm that sounded like the ticking of a clock approaching a final hour. She looked at the gathered group with an expression of profound maternal sadness, a look that made the inspector shift uncomfortably in his seat. "It is a fascinating thing about the human mind," Miss Marple began, her voice clear and unwavering. "We are so easily led by the spectacle of what we expect to see. We saw a blue jewel on a bride's neck, and because it sparkled in the sunlight, we assumed it was the Star of the Orient. We saw a man with jewelers' snips and financial troubles, and we assumed he was a thief. But in St. Mary Mead, as in life, the most elaborate stage sets are often designed to hide the most hollow of rooms. The tragedy that occurred here was not a crime of greed committed by a stranger, but a crime of pride committed by those who could not bear the thought of being found wanting. The sapphire was not stolen during the reception. It had been absent from the very moment the wedding party stepped onto these lawns." Inspector Slack leaned forward, his face reddening with impatience. "But the witnesses, Miss Marple, the photographs." Everyone saw the stone. "They saw what they were meant to see, Inspector," Miss Marple replied gently, "a masterpiece of optical redirection. The Major and his sister have been living on the edge of ruin for years. The real sapphire was pawned long ago to keep this estate from the auctioneer's gavel. To maintain the facade during the wedding, they enlisted the help of Mr. Tilling, a man whose skill with lenses is as great as his skill with lilies. He constructed a blue-tinted celluloid lens, a fragment of which I found in the rosebush. When placed in a specific frame and angled against the sun, it created a brilliant blue reflection that mimicked the jewel for the distant crowd and the cameras. But a fake is a fragile thing, Inspector. It cannot survive the scrutiny of a bride who reaches up to touch her own reflection." She turned her gaze toward the Major, whose eyes were fixed on the floor. Celia Randall was an observant girl. During the reception, she must have felt the lightness of the chain, or noticed the strange, static quality of the stone in the mirror. When she confronted the Major near the sundial, the entire house of cards began to tremble. If she had spoken, the fraud would have been exposed, the insurance claim for the planned theft would have been impossible, and the Blake name would have been dragged through the mud of a public scandal. To a man of the Major's rigid temperament, a scandal is a fate worse than death. He did not mean to kill her. Perhaps he only meant to silence her with a strong sedative in her champagne, a temporary measure to buy time. But he was clumsy in his desperation, and her heart, already strained by the day's excitement, simply stopped. Miss Marple then looked at Muriel Blake, who remained motionless by the fire. And then there was the matter of the jewel's disappearance. You couldn't have a fake found on a dead body. You removed the lens fragmentor most of Itan, the gold chain, and you used the sundial as a temporary hiding place for the real sapphire, which you had brought back from London just for the church service to ensure the priest and the registry witnesses were not deceived. I found the metallic shavings where the sundial had been pried open and the silver-handled snips that you, Muriel, planted in Raymond West's luggage to provide the police with a convenient villain. You even wrote that letter about a secret lover to blacken poor Celia's name, hoping the inspector's prejudices would do the rest of your work for you. The silence that followed was broken only by the sharp, metallic snap of Slack's notebook closing. The Major did not look up. He seemed to have collapsed inward, his military bearing finally shattered by the weight of the truth. Muriel Blake merely tightened her grip on the mantelpiece, her eyes cold and defiant even in defeat. Miss Marple sighed, her needles resuming their steady click. The mystery was no longer a matter of missing jewels or London thieves. It was a sad, sordid account of a family that had preferred a murder to a loss of face. As the inspector signalled to his men, Miss Marple looked out at the garden, where the sun continued to shine on the roses, indifferent to the ruin of the house they adorned. The following week in St. Mary Mead arrived with a peculiar, heavy stillness, as if the village were collectively holding its breath after a long and exhausting fever. The yellow police tape that had cordoned off the stone sundial at the Blake estate was gone, leaving only flattened patches of grass that would take many weeks of soft English rain and gentle sun to recover. The wedding of the season was now a memory, but one that tasted of ash rather than the sweet perfume of tiered cake and celebratory champagne. At the local post office, the gossip had not ceased, but it had shifted in tone. There was less excitement now and more of a sombre, reflective quality. The residents walked a little more slowly, and when they met one another's gaze over a garden hedge, there was a fleeting moment of hesitation, as if they were all wondering what other desperate secrets might be buried beneath the tidy, well-kept flower beds of their neighbours. Miss Marple sat in her garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm golden glow over her lavender bushes. She was engaged in the delicate task of winding a fresh skein of soft grey wool, her movements rhythmic and purposeful. From her vantage point she could see the distant spire of the church and the quiet lane that led toward the gates of the Blake Manor. The house was quiet now, its windows shuttered, the grand rooms standing like silent sentinels over an empty legacy. Major Richard Blake and his sister Muriel had been removed to the county jail, and the village was left to grapple with the reality that the family they had looked up to for generations was the same family that had traded a young woman's life for a hollow reputation. It was a paradox many found hard to swallow. Mrs. Bantry arrived at the gate, looking more tired than Miss Marple had ever seen her. She did not burst with news today. Instead, she sat quietly on the garden bench, watching a white butterfly dance over the foxgloves. "It is the quietness that I find so unsettling, Jane," she said eventually, her voice barely a whisper. "To think that the Major and Muriel sat in that grand library evening after evening, nursing such a terrible growing rot in their finances. They were always so polite, so concerned with the right way of doing things. It makes one feel that one doesn't really know anyone at all. We see the labels we put on people, the officer, the lady, the landowner, but we never really see the person behind the uniform." Miss Marple tucked the end of the wool into the ball and looked at her friend with a gaze of profound maternal pity. "People are so very much like gardens, Dolly. We see the blooms and the well-kept paths, but we often forget the roots that go down deep into the dark, cold earth. The Blakes were people who lived entirely for the image they projected, feeding a pride that should have been allowed to wither long ago. They thought they were enacting a necessary defense of their family name, but in truth, they were merely building a prison for themselves. It is a very sad thing when a person allows a single fear of social ruin to define the rest of their lives. It poisons the soil, you see, and eventually, nothing healthy or honest can grow there." The conversation turned briefly to Raymond West, who had been fully exonerated and had returned to London with a renewed, if somewhat cynical, inspiration for his next novel. His departure was seen as a sign of his recovery. though Miss Marple suspected he would always carry a certain wariness of country weddings and blue glass. The estate itself was to be sold to settle the massive debts that had triggered the tragedy, a decision that Miss Marple felt was both wise and necessary. The grounds held too many ghosts, and the village, for all its charm, could be a very difficult place for those associated with such a public fall from grace. As the sun began to dip behind the elms, casting long purple shadows across the grass, Miss Marple picked up her knitting. The grey wool was beginning to take shape, row by row, stitch by stitch. The world was a place of infinite complexity and often of great sorrow, but she found a certain comfort in the predictability of human nature. She understood that while the settings might change from a theatre to a vicarage to a garden wedding, the motivations remained the same. Fear, vanity, and the desire to belong were the constants of the human condition, but so too were the small acts of kindness and the persistent search for the truth. She went into her house as the first evening star appeared, a small, solitary figure who had once again seen through the facade to the reality beneath. The curtain had fallen on the tragedy of the Star of the Orient, and Miss Marple was content to let the silence return to St. Mary Mead.